Mhm. Hey guys, welcome. Those of you who are here already. I got Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy here to talk about his channel and theological stuff. And so, Michael, tell us a little about yourself and your channel and history and all that, if you would.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Jones. I just got my master's in philosophy. I run the Inspiring Philosophy channel. I make a lot of different apologetic videos.
Nice. So, I was curious, like, what kind of tips you could offer other YouTubers and just in general, like for making, because I'm always impressed by your quality, how good your editing and the way, even just down to the details. Like, because I used to record music, and so I catch little details like that, just kind of naturally. And so I've always just like I can tell like the little things you do or whatever with sound and all that stuff. So like, what would you say to someone trying to make quality videos, and like what kind of research would you say you do, or maybe you can offer some tips on that?
Well, I would say think of quality over quantity. I mean, I could put out a video a day that would be poorly researched, not a lot of effort into it, but it's about quality videos in my view. So spend the time putting in the effort to some of these videos and, uh, learn to do video editing. I mean, no, it sucks. It takes a long time to learn a lot of the video editing techniques when you go into Adobe Premiere and After Effects, but it pays off in the end. So if you want to make good quality videos, learn to edit, focus in on that, and that is the step forward. I also tell people that try. This is kind of ironic, but to do because we're doing one now, but do less interviews. People want to see short form or uh, shorter style videos. Those tend to get more views in the long run. Whereas interviews, people watch them when they first come out, and then no one watches them, months later. But so I tell people if you want to try to set yourself out from the rest and try to do short form stuff, throw in a lot of quality. That's going to be what's really going to get you going, I'd say. Now that doesn't
Yes.
to be clear, that doesn't mean don't do interviews because I do interviews on my channel, but just like minimize them.
Yeah, you've gotten some good interviews. I got to rewatch that Bart Ehrman one again. I tend to like Bart Ehrman, to be honest. Like in a lot of ways, like I disagree, right? But some of the things he does, maybe because I'm biased, and so he's backing up some of the things I think or something. But that's totally what's going on there. But I think he's obviously respected as a good scholar. I mean, I remember that was one that was really good. But do you? I find that making, I need to take your advice basically is what I'm saying. But like I intend, you have all these intentions, like I'm going to get a, video editing software and I need to do that. Right. But what kind do you use? I have no idea how you do those ones where you're like zooming in on a map and stuff like that. And, like, is that like a special program? How do you manage that?
Well,
And
most
what
of
kind
what I do is in Adobe Premiere, but for like going to do 3D space, like zoom ins on maps, I have to do those in After Effects. So in After Effects, you can put a camera in the composition, and then you can move in and out of the space. Left, excuse me, left, right. You can also rotate the camera. So that's how you do that.
so it's just like showing you the laid out and then yeah, okay. I've seen similar editing plugins or whatever you call it. Yeah. So like,
Yeah.
what about like research? So like, if for whatever reason you decide like your Exodus series, for instance, like I know the whole thing, whatever you want to call it, like you took it down out of integrity, right? And I tend to actually agree with your original conclusion, but I can't say I've studied it closely enough, right? But like, you know, I respect your integrity, for your position, and so like, can you speak to that at all? Like, what went on there? You just got more information, and you felt like you needed to redo it, right? Because you just found out more information, or
Well, yeah.
and,
So, I mean, what happened with that is that I did a lot of research because early on, some people, I won't say who they are, said that really all the evidence was for the early date, and don't listen to people like Dr. Falk because he's really mean, and if you go after him, he'll just attack you for not agreeing with him. I found that not to be true. I think the more you get to know him, the nicer he is. So I would say that. Uh, but so I was sort of stirred down that path, and then when I was confronted with Dr. Falk, who responded, and then we talked in private a lot, I realized a lot of the evidence didn't line up. For example, one of the big reasons I held to the early date was early date proponents like Scott Stripling or Douglas Petrovich said that Avaris was abandoned. This is the city in Egypt where Israel or the Hebrews would have lived at, was abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II. And I was like, great. And they had all these quotes from Manfred B-Tech to back that up. I was like, great. The problem is then when you go further into B-Tech, you realize that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about when the native Egyptians abandoned the palatial compound there. So it was abandoned, but by the Egyptians. The Semitic population stayed on until the Ramesside period when they abandoned the site. So it was sort of this thing about why that's one of the main reasons I changed my view. And then when that crack opened, other cracks started to go as well, because then I started to question a bunch of other things. So that was just an example. So I say all that to say this: talk to scholars. They want to talk. They like talking about their research. They're always open to talking about these things that they spent their lives working on. So feel free to. I mean, I tell people sometimes it's just, if you reach out to them and they have some free time, they get back to you. A lot have gone back to me. I'm surprised how many are willing to talk and get back to me. I'm currently working with a scholar named Benjamin Kilker, and he is like so happy I'm going to do videos on some of his papers. He's like, here's another paper I'm writing that's going to come out in the fall. You want to do one of this? I'm like, you bet I do. So that kind of thing. I try to read a lot too. So I try to read a minimal of 30 pages a day from a book or collection of papers, just to make sure I'm constantly keeping up on research and looking for new things. So read a lot. I mean, it requires a lot of reading, but I mean, it doesn't have to consume your day. You could read 30 pages in less than an hour. I don't see that as consuming my day. So keep that in mind. So generally, I would say to do good research, talk to scholars, read scholars that you don't agree with. Like this year, I've read scholars like Joel Baden, Richard Elliott Friedman. I've read some Bart Ehrman, trying to get different opinions on certain things. So that's what I would say. Read a lot. Don't put yourself in an echo chamber, and be willing to talk to scholars and accept correction when they come at you.
yeah, for me, I feel like I've been blessed by my, you know, I remember it was scary, but like just said, I'm just going to listen to what some other people have to say on this. And like, you should do that. And if, I think people are scared to do that, right? Like it's you get in your echo chamber, and everybody, in fundamental circles, especially, like, don't even look at that sort of thing, like don't,
Well, I
I'm
mean, a
extreme.
lot of people do that. I've seen atheists do that online. I've seen atheists go like, joke on Twitter, well, I'm not going to watch that apologetic or that Christian video because they're idiots. They're stupid. They're biased. And I'll see them do this in their hangouts. They'll say things like, well, all Christian scholars just sort of color the way they view the data because they have to assume the Bible's true. So we can't really take what they say. I did a video recently on this in the spring where I asked the question, are Christian scholars more biased than atheist scholars? And of course, the research in psychology says no, but I still see atheists doing this, claiming that Christians are bias and you can't really trust them, and muddying the water constantly. So fundamentalists do it. You're correct, but I see other people do it. I can catch myself doing it sometimes where I'm like, I don't have to listen to them. They're an idiot, or they don't disagree with me. And that I have to catch myself and try not to do that.
Yeah. You only have so much time in the day. So like, yeah, I totally agree with that too. But like, yeah, like you gotta like, people get offended easily, and I do too, and I can, and so, but just got to kind of let it go. But at the same time, yeah, get out of your echo chamber. I like that idea. You shouldn't be scared of what you might find out, right? So, but I get it why it's difficult, right? Especially if it's like kind of a comfort or whatever to you, and so I
Oh
mean, I
yeah.
find that. Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt and like
Uh-huh.
some of his? I sometimes I wonder if he's totally right. Like I tend to not think he's totally right about like the rider on the elephant and like how I say this all the time, not necessarily totally seriously, but like people, and in some sense, I think this is more true than people realize. But like, I'm not saying truth doesn't exist. That was another one of your shorts I like where you're talking about scientism. And I played it last night, just uh, trying to get people to ask questions or whatever for this interview. But like, in some ways, sometimes we do end up choosing like certain things we believe, and then you just kind of run with it and find reasons to back it up after the fact. Like I think that's partly true sometimes, and I kind of want to fight that notion, but I can't help but think it's partially true. What do you make of that? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I would disagree with Jonathan Haidt when he says all moral knowledge reduces to emotions. That's one of his things. I think there is rationality involved, and I believe it was the philosopher John May. I can't remember his first name, but he wrote a reply to Haidt and some other scholars that said that it all reduces to emotions, and says no, there's rationality involved. I don't think it's all just emotion. But yeah, I do agree with Haidt on the idea of these moral foundations. They definitely do influence us, and it can be hard sometimes. Like uh, I put off reading Joel Baden until like last summer because I was worried that he would challenge my views, and he did, because he offers a lot of really interesting arguments in favor of the documentary hypothesis. But ultimately, I wasn't convinced. And then after I read it, I was like, well, I'm glad I did, because now I know, and I'm not hiding from it. And same thing when I read Stackert or Richard Elliott Friedman. I was glad I was reading them, and when I was done, because I'm like, okay, now I understand their position better. Uh, I can see where their arguments are coming from. And if I was convinced of their views, I don't think that would have been a huge problem. I would have had to rework some things. I've changed views, as people know, on many things. But I think it's very good to get out of that echo chamber, and we have to force ourselves to.
Yeah, yeah, and you never, if you get past certain things, right? So, oh, something I wanted to ask you about that. What was it?
It'll come to you.
I'm drawing a blank. Um, so, one second, let me check.
It'll come to you. But but yeah, I would definitely encourage people to read people that you disagree with, for sure. And another good way, another thing to add is debates as well. Debate people. Don't be afraid to debate people, even on social media. Just try to not lose your cool. Because one of the things I did early in my channel was try to debate people in the comments as much as possible, and it definitely opened me up to a lot of new ideas that I wasn't aware of at the time. So I encourage people to take your worldviews out into public discourse and to put them up for public scrutiny. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely, totally with you on that one. Do you what do you think goes wrong with that sort of? Do you think people get too full of themselves, or do you think it gets too nasty and it's not you know
Yeah, people
productive
get
sort of
tribal.
thing?
People get
Yeah,
tribal. I mean, I get, for example, I'll get mad at young Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists get mad at me, and then we just start insulting each other.
yeah,
I've been guilty of that, but I mean, like, it is what it is. I try not to do it, but I mean, like, I just had a debate with Marcus Ross, and he's a very nice guy. He's very intelligent. A lot of respect for him, even though we disagree on a lot of things. I thought some of the things he said in the debate were in error and were
do you
not.
recall I'm curious which one you would say, because I felt like you to be fair to you, I'm not sure I could repeat it, to be honest, but some of the points you were making, I'm not sure if he was fully uh, knew what you were saying, were trying to say about it, and what you weren't, like he thought you were asserting something you weren't, in a sense, right? Or he wasn't catching on to what exactly your point was. I'm trying to remember what that was, but
Well, I mean, he opened his cross examination by noting that like Kenneth Matthews and John Walton don't agree with me on everything, and I'm like, duh. I mean, no one agrees. Like, and then and then he ends the debate by quoting John Day, who he doesn't agree with. So it's okay for him to quote people he doesn't agree with entirely on. But if I quote Matthews or Walton, oh no, they don't agree with you on everything. It's like, do you see the double standard there? And then at the end, he said, in
Yeah.
the Q&A, he made some claims that were just not true. Like he tried to say that young Earth creationism, the view of the day age creation, young Earth view, has stood the test of time. And that really, if you study the history, like Michael Roberts, who's an historian, or Ronald Numbers, an historian, has laid out, it's a little bit more wonky than that. It's not this idea that it actually, for the most part, died out in the 1800s temporarily and then came back in the 1900s. But that's another story for another time. But so, I mean, there were just some things like that I thought were just like a little off-putting. But, I still think he's a nice guy.
Yeah, yeah. He seemed like he knew where he wanted to go, but I'm not sure. I think he's so focused on that.
He's the most intelligent young Earth creationist I've debated, I would say.
Yeah. What's his? Where does he work? Is he just some guy, or like does he work for ICR or something? Oh, I didn't even know.
Forget where he works. He does work for some organization, but he has a doctorate in paleontology, so he's a bona fide scientist for sure.
Yeah. So, what's your position? I forget. I want to make sure I get it right. But you're a moral realist or no?
Of course, yeah. I'm a moral realist, yeah.
Right. Okay. That would be rare for Christians not to be, I suppose. Uh, do you want to comment on that? Do you think isn't that true?
I don't think I've ever met a Christian that's a moral subjectivist. Now I have met some layman Christians that they don't realize it because they just say it's whatever the subjective whims or God are. So if God told me to go kill someone, kill an innocent person, I would. And they don't understand the moral complexity of what they're saying there because God wouldn't command such a thing.
So I have this intuition, and but like I'm not really I can't speak well on philosophy as well as I'd like to, anyways, but I'm really interested in the subject. So like I from my perspective growing up and Adventist view on the law sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
it strikes me that like the way many Christians talk about the law, or the moral parts of the law, is being like done away with. I struggle with how to understand that in light of the fact that we want to say like God is this. So I accept Craig's view, or what he talks about, the simple view. I think there's more things to be said about how that works with the Euthyphro dilemma and all that. But I tend to think that sounds right. And so as far as morals aren't above God or below God, it's not arbitrary, but it's not something God had to, it's not coming from above God or whatever, however you want to say that. Maybe you can articulate it better, but if that's true, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Finish your thought. What is it?
No, that's it. I was just thinking like, how can we possibly abandon this? Like in the new covenant, like it depends on what you mean by abandoning it, I suppose. But that's my thoughts. Like we can't say that and then turn around and say God's moral law is a reflection of who he is, which can't change in my view. Right. So it's like, although that can get weird, I guess, but that seems to be my intuition. Like we have to stand for that, or they're arbitrary in some degree, like a divine command theory. Although I'm learning that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think some smart people have an idea of divine command theory, but that's kind of another thing. But yeah, go ahead. Whatever you want to say about it, or correct me or whatever.
So the scriptural understanding with regards to the law is a little different, but with regards to the moral law from God, I think we need to avoid the idea of just sort of saying God exists and then just arbitrarily like grounding the moral law in God. I don't think that's the right approach. I think we need to start with moral realism and say, yes, there are objective moral values and duties. Then to study the ontology of them. So in objective moral values and duties, we would say there are objective prescriptions for us. Like it's wrong to rape, torture, murder an innocent life, this kind of thing. Well, objective facts about reality are grounded in descriptions. I could describe for you when someone, stabs another person with a knife, but I cannot find in objective reality the prescriptions. It's only you're only going to get descriptions. So if there are objective prescriptions, prescriptions only exist between agents. I can prescribe to you maybe to watch my family while I'm away. I've given that prescription for you, so it exists between agents. So if there are objective prescriptions for us, that would imply there was some sort of agency involved in moral values and duties. Take another example, the moral ideal. We can picture the moral ideal. It's like this perfect agent that always does what is good, does what is right, knows what the right thing to do is. But the moral idea implies there has to be some sort of agency there. There is no such thing as an ideal sense of morality that is divorced from agency. We picture the ideal doing what is right. So it implies there's agency in there. So to bring that all around, we start with moral realism. There are moral values and duties that are objective. But within the ontology of that, there seems to be some sort of agency going on. So my position is, as if you believe there are objective moral values and duties, that's God. You're just describing God or his moral character in that way. It's not this idea that they're just arbitrarily grounded in a being called God. The very existence of objective moral values and duties implies some sort of necessary agency from which they come from. So that's my approach when it comes to the moral argument. Start with moral realism, see their moral values and duties, and then when we study the ontology of them, well, it seems like it seems that there is a rational, necessary source that we call objective moral values and duties. But that's God. That's what we would say God is. So they're one and the same. It's like realizing water and H2O are the same thing. They're not two different things. We don't ground water in H2O. They're just are the same. They're equal to one another. Same with my view on it when it comes to the moral argument.
Yeah, I have a friend. His name's Danny, and he has a channel called Phil Talk. What was he saying about that? Oh, he's always talking about morals being subjective or whatever, because they're and he always talks about in terms of like preferences of a personal preference or whatever. And I'm always and he kind of gets me sidetracked, and then I stop and I think like at least biblically speaking, it seems like morals have more to do with like, personal interaction with others, like your duties before others. And so, I'm not really sure how those interact, but I feel like the question gets more difficult for a subjectivist when you start to think of things and like not so much about yourself, but about how you interact with others or whatever. There's other people that have some weird ideas on this, and like objections to God for like this guy named, I'm sure you've heard of T-Jump or whatever. His moral landscape is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so people try to ground like moral values and like obligations with one another. And so like, it's wrong to kill an innocent life because, you have an obligation not to kill that innocent life. I don't think you can ground them in human interactions. So let's say you take an example. Let's say I meet someone who's suicidal and they want me to kill them. I still would say it's wrong. I'd say there's an objective obligation I have to not do that. I don't think we can ground them in mere human relations.
I think that makes sense. That makes sense. I'm just thinking about it wrong, probably. I guess it's just depending on I didn't really stipulate what exactly. I didn't have a good example. What I mean, but yeah, I think that's a good point. Like I tend to look at it like, theologically, I look at it like God being love. It's like, his intentions are always good in a certain sense or in every sense, and so, this is kind of like what it looks like to like bear the image of God fully, right? Like how Christ doesn't sin, sort of thing. But maybe we can talk about what kind of things you found out or concluded in I know there's I think you have a separate video, and then there's like a 3-part series maybe on the subject of how to think about the law coming down in the ancient Near East culture and how it.
The Mosaic law. I separate that from ethics itself because I don't think I agree with scholars like John Walton that the Mosaic law is not really doing ethics. You could say there's ethical stipulations that are a part of it, but just so everyone knows, it's really thundering and lightning over here. So if my power goes out, I'm sorry. In Tucson, we get monsoons, so we get these one time of the year, which is now. We get monsoon season, so we get all these storms and power just randomly goes out. So apologize if I just drop out. It won't be my fault. But back with regards to the law itself. So in the ancient Near Eastern context, they would not have understood this as if it was like absolutely binding ethical laws for all time. This was more about like guidance. The law that we call, it's really the Torah, is more about God giving guidance to Israel on how to be a light to the nations around them. What could they do that would show order, that would show holiness to the nations in that context? So when you read the ancient Near Eastern law codes, like Code of Hammurabi, Lipit Ishtar, Middle Assyrian laws, they're not laying down the laws of the land. This is an attempt for a king to display his wisdom. This is what he would see as justice. It's like, you could think of it more in terms of Proverbs. Proverbs has like, answer a fool in his way, and you will become like him, or not answer a fool, and he will think he's right. Okay, well, it's not really giving you guidance on how to deal with a fool. It's teaching you wisdom on the nature of fools, and that Proverbs sort of does this. It's not giving you necessarily commands. It's trying to teach you how to think about wisdom generally, and you're supposed to take that whole wisdom as a whole and see how you can apply it in certain circumstances. The
Yeah,
law of the yeah,
I
the
found
Torah
I
is sort of
found
doing
that
something
part.
similar.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Yeah, the
Uh,
Torah is sort of doing something very similar. It's saying like this is God saying this is what justice would look like. Now, obviously, when they apply that into the practical situations of life, there's going to be some, it's not going to be able to work entirely. Like this is why Deuteronomy talks about taking your cases before judges in places like 17 and 19, 21 as well. Like, let judges use their wisdom to decide what is right and what is the proper action to take. They don't, it doesn't say, pull up the Torah and see whatever, if someone committed adultery, the command, just do that. No, they have to understand that to apply this wisdom they've gotten from God, they need judges to discern what is the best thing to do.
yeah, this is just logic. I mean, if you think about it, it seems to me like I found this. No, yeah, I found this very convincing. To me, it struck me as like, yeah, like maybe these are like you could look at it like the maximum sentence sort of thing, and then but they work it out. Just like we look at case law now, like they refer to other rulings from the past and things like that to help guide the
Exactly.
idea. And so that's I feel like there's really no getting around that if you're being honest. But then the things that came up to my mind that maybe could be an issue on that doesn't have to be an issue, but on some level, like when we think about depending on our view of the atonement, I tend to have actually felt like penal substitution is less and less true, but that substitutionary atonement is necessary at minimum. And then I think the other theories come to bear on it as well. They're not like it's not one or the other. It's one main one, probably like substitution, and then there's different versions of that, of course. Obviously, if you're a Calvinist or something, you're going to go with penal substitution, I think by default. But like in some sense, Christ died for our sins, and he took our place, right? So by taking the death penalty, like how would you think of that? And I mean, do you think of that in regards to something that's related to God's law? I presume, right? Like sin is the transgression of the law, sort of thing. And so, how do we, like, if I accept what you were saying about the law, and I tend to agree with it,
Mm-hmm.
how should we think about that, or how would you think about that?
Well, we
If that
shouldn't
made any
think that Israel lacked commands. I mean, they did their commands are part of the Torah, so there are certain things they have to do, like you shall not make a graven image, you should have no God before me. An important part when it comes to the atonement is we have to look, Genesis as well as Leviticus, I would say. So in Leviticus, I believe it's 8. It says that Aaron and the priest they cannot enter the sanctuary for 7 days. They need to be consecrated. And then in Leviticus 9, I believe it is that they have to make a sacrifice before they can even enter the tent of meeting. So a sacrifice has to be made to sort of enter the temple of meeting. And we kind of see something similar in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve are sort of like exiled from the garden for their sin, they have to cover their nakedness. Then in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel, they seem to have to sort of make an offering or a sacrifice to sort of meet with God again in that sense. So this idea that there has to be some sort of sacrifice made to sort of reconnect some sort of communion with God, I think is important. I think that's what the atonement is drawing on. Christ's sacrifice reconnects us to God. And so then I would look at it, I'm not sure what to label it, but I would say it's this idea of Jesus sort of becoming this representative for all those grafted into him. Like Adam was the priest that failed, all in creation fell with him. Now Christ is the priest that succeeded. He made atonement for us. And so those all covered sort of under his umbrella are covered by his atonement. And now his resurrection is important because he came back to sort of intercede on our behalf or mediate for us. So he's the priest in the heavenly tabernacle, according to the book of Hebrews, that mediates before us. His own sacrifice is the atonement that made it. So he can stay in the tent of meeting the whole time with the Father. He doesn't have to keep making these sort of sacrifices as the Levitical priest would have had to. So that's something I'm sort of exploring right now in terms of what substitutionary or atonement do I hold to. But generally, I think it has to be related around that. It has to be very much connected to the Levitical act of having to make a sacrifice in Leviticus 9 to enter the tabernacle.
Yeah, that's interesting. My growing up and stuff with Adventism, they have like a strong literal sense of like a heavenly temple sanctuary they emphasize or whatever, and like Christ is like it's related to the Day of Atonement, and but there's a lot of verses that talk about a heavenly temple. Now, I did want to ask you about that too, because I know I think you said you said you accept kind of the idea of Walton, which I also actually do find a lot of his insights very interesting, and probably right. Regarding what's going on with the text in early, in Genesis 1 through 3 or whatever, and I like the idea that I actually see like there's some sort of picture going on there that almost is like history laid out in a certain sense, but and that's another thing I wanted to ask you about too is what's going on with the early church fathers and the way they talk about. You mentioned it in that Young Earth Creationist video, um, regarding the early church fathers and what they were saying. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what your position is on what they were saying because I think you were saying that they. Sorry to change the subject here and go on a trail here, but this is something I wanted to ask you. Like you were. It seemed like you were saying in that video that you were saying that from early on, people didn't necessarily take a literal view of the days, right? And you referred to some quotes from like I think Barnabas and Irenaeus maybe.
Yeah, so Irenaeus is, I believe, one. I know Clement of Alexandria is definitely another. Saint Athanasius the Great, and of course, his name just went out of my head. But Augustine, yeah, Augustine. So a lot of early church fathers took this view, the idea that days were not literal. Now they were young Earth creationists, to be sure, because there was no history detailing further back than Genesis. It's not like today where we have historical geology. They were working with what they got. But they did not think the days were literal days. God did not literally create days 1 through 7. They thought they were metaphorical, or they were meant to explain, I think Augustine used this language, to explain to the ignorant, because the ignorant couldn't follow the idea that God could just create everything instantly. Now, the reason why they're doing this is because they were dealing with a lot of Gnostic heresies, the idea that, the God of the Old Testament was evil. So Gnostics would bring up the idea that, it says, that Adam was going to die on the day he ate of the fruit, but he didn't die. So that God was a liar. And they would bring up things, well, days in Genesis are not what you think. They're not literal. They're spiritual days. Augustine would use that language. And Augustine directly contrasted the days of Genesis 1 with in Genesis 2, it says, in the day the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. So he says, well, it's all one day in Genesis 2, and in Genesis 1, it's 7 days. So that's the reason they were taking that approach. And they also were dealing with objections from pagans and said, well, your God's so stupid and ignorant and weak. It takes him 7 days to make everything. Why couldn't he do it instantly? And so they said, well, he did. The days were just metaphorical, or they were used for spiritual significance, or they were allegorical. There were different ways to look at it. That was generally what they were dealing with in that sort of context. So yeah, many early church fathers, even though they thought the earth was about 6,000 years old, maybe 10,000, because a lot of them use Septuagint, so that makes it a little bit older. But they would still hold to the idea that the days were metaphorical. Clement of Alexandria being one of them. He was very early on.
You're saying like your point is just to say it's not merely this one rigid thing going on in the verse. It's not merely history, and I tend to actually agree with that. So I do take them literally, but I think what they're hitting on, is that there's more theological going on, in this, whatever that is. I'm not going to posit my theories or whatever, but I just mean like, yeah, I think that was going on too. I think that's fair.
And the objection that we older earthers always bring up, which is, how do you have evening and morning on days 1 through 3 if the sun is not created till day 4, was brought up by early church fathers. I mean, they recognize this as well. So that's one of the reasons they were taking this sort of allegorical approach to the day. It's not this idea that God literally took 7 days to create everything. This was sort of used for, sort of poetic emphasis, maybe is the way to use it, or sort of explain how God would have created things, but he did it all instantly in some of their views.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just to hear what you think of this. But so whenever I bring this up, Christians get, like, I understand, like, people make all these correlations with other gods and like zeitgeist and all that's been debunked or whatever. And I agree with that. But like I think it's undeniable that the Bible in some sense likens Jesus to the great light or the sun as we understand it. And like, but not to say but I think people run with that too, wild, like trying to say it's just astronomical, myth or whatever that's been adapted or something. I don't take it that way, but I do think there's several verses that like Malachi 4, it says talking about Christ's second coming and the destruction of the wicked, and it's going to be burning like an oven, and he rises from the east, and but like he's literally called the Son of Righteousness, Sun there, and it's clearly messianic. And then another one, I'll give you a couple examples and just see how you would respond to this. But like I think Psalm 19 says, when it's speaking of the sun going through the sky, it talks about like the sun is hidden in its chamber, like like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber or something like that. And then things like that. And then, John 1, right? Like he's the great light. And so he's the true great light. And so I always wonder, like, I mean, what would you say to that? Let's start there. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, I just think it's a metaphor it's using to say he's the true source, light. You know what I mean? But do you think that's wrong way to look at it, or? Oh, I think you're on mute. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. My bad.
No
So
worries.
the biblical authors use metaphors all the time to describe God. They describe God as having a womb at times, or crying out in labor. I believe in Deuteronomy 32. They say he's the rider on the clouds. And so, some people, when you look at some sort of scholars, they'll say they have all these interesting theories about how the origins of where Yahweh comes from. Some say he was originally a sun deity, and that's why we can see sun imagery in the Bible. And some say, no, he was originally a storm deity. That's why we see storm imagery in the Bible. Some say, one scholar even says he was a metallurgy deity, and that's why we see references to metallurgy in the Bible. But I mean, like, there's just a lot of metaphors, and you can pick and choose the ones you want and say, aha, see, I figured it out. I mean, well, I could take all the metaphors of God, like crying in labor or having a womb, and go, he was originally a female deity, a mother goddess, right? I mean, you can pick and choose what you want.
We joke about that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could say he was originally a warrior deity, just from Exodus 15, because he fights for Israel. You could do all these types of things, but they just use metaphors. And if you look at the whole biblical theology, he's very much described as the creator deity. He lacks a beginning. He doesn't have this idea of a beginning at all. So there's no origin of the god, as it is in other myths, like what is with Baal or Egyptian deities. So he's very distinct and unique if you take all of biblical theology together. I'm cautious against taking metaphors out of the Bible and running wild with it, because I've seen he could become a metallurgy deity, he could become a sun deity, he could become a storm deity, he could become a woman or a female deity. I mean, what do you go with here? So I think we need to be careful with doing that and not reading too much into the metaphors.
Yeah, like Jordan Maxwell. I don't know if you remember some of his nonsense or whatever. That guy.
I did a response to him on TikTok recently. Yeah, but
oh, you did? I missed that one.
I don't think I posted it to YouTube yet, but he tried to claim that Lucifer was in the Bible, and it's like, no, he isn't. Or no, he tried to claim that Jesus is called Lucifer in the last chapter of Revelation. And I'm like, no, he isn't. You just read the English. You didn't read what it actually says in the Greek.
Yeah, that's just like a Latin, what do you call it? A Latin transliteration or whatever, something like that, or whatever. It's just a word for a name that means something that isn't a particular language through history or whatever, right? I mean,
right. Well,
like
it's not even the Latin word in the Vulgate does not show up in Revelation. It only shows up in Isaiah, and when it's
right, Isaiah 16 or whatever it is. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to work through for people, I think, regarding how we should see Satan. I tend to think, I mean, what's your view on, say, like Ezekiel 28? I mean, some people have said that's Adam or whatever, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I was just reading Catherine McDowell, and she makes a pretty good case it's probably not. Heiser also makes a case, as well as Ben Stanhope, that Ezekiel 28, I believe it's Isaiah 10. It's either Isaiah 10 or 14.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, earlier chapter. Yeah.
But I think what is happening is these earthly kings are being described, and they're paralleling other texts or oral traditions they know about the fall of Satan. So they're like comparing the king of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, to the fall of the prince, or the Satan that fell. And I think Heiser makes a pretty good case that that's also connected to the serpent in Eden as well. So I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, but see, I'm really interested in that too. I'm pretty ignorant about it, but I find it. I know, like Rob from Sentinel Apologetics has kind of echoed things that Heiser talks about too with the Nakash, and I think that's all totally right. I think even like I have no issue with the fact that the Bible uses ancient Near East context for like I forget Tiamat, in the I think that it makes perfect sense to adapt that for the Bible writers to use that as as a polemic, or even if that is a polemic, or more of like a maybe that is like an adaptation or whatever, because it's like true, right? And like so it's just like it's a historical development, but that doesn't mean it's not like true on the deeper sense, right? So
Yeah,
like
well, think of Ezekiel 28. It says you were a sealer of perfection. Now, there's something interesting because some scholars like H.J. Van Dyke has argued that maybe it contains an enclitic mem. So that means the last letter is meant to be silent. And there are enclitic mems other places in Ezekiel, like 26, 27, I believe. And so now if you remove the mem, it would not say you're a sealer of perfection. It would say you are a serpent of perfection.
oh wow,
In
that's interesting.
in Aramaic. It would be an Aramaic reference
Okay,
there. It's not
Aramaic,
Hebrew.
not Hebrew.
So now that's possible, but it's a little hard to prove because you have to. We're not entirely sure if that's directly how to translate it. But Heiser brought this up, and I went and looked in H.A. Van Dyke's book. Ezekiel's Prophecy on Tyre is the name of it, and it makes a pretty interesting case there. That may be an enclitic mem that's been added onto there, and it's just meant to be silent. And so the only problem is this would be the only time this word for serpent ever occurs anywhere in the Bible. So it's just it's a little speculative, but it is an interesting argument that it may be referring to the serpent in Eden in just this very, using a lot of this type of language.
Yeah, I wondered that maybe you can give me your thoughts on this. Like, so I know, I believe the Aramaic, or maybe it's the Akkadian or something, I forget, but they're both Semitic languages or whatever, and I think it was an older language, depending on what your view is on Hebrew or whatever, how old it is, but that there's the same word for serpent in this other language. Maybe they clearly are probably related, right, in development, but like the fact, so like, or here I'll ask it this way: is Nakash mean all, like the adjective, noun, and verb forms, like Heiser's pointed out, right? Like it's the shining one. What is it? The adjective one.
Yeah. So there's he argues that he argues the Nahash in Genesis 3 is really a triple onton. It's meant to be serpent, divine, or a shining one, and really how you supply the vowels can be any of those. So if you look in the ISV International Standard Version, they actually translate it as shining one in that one. So, and it's related to other Hebrew words like Nehushtet, which refer to like a shiny brass. So it could very well be what's sort of going on in there. But that's an interesting. But for one, when we get to the talking about the serpent, I mean, it should be clear we're not dealing with a regular serpent. This is something talking. I think the authors are trying to apply to us. This is not just a typical snake that slithers on the ground.
So right. We don't have to posit that Satan took over a serpent. That's probably not right. It's probably, I would argue that word, I would wonder, I should say, to be fair, but like, did that word have its meaning because that was a primordial actual like thing that gets applied to it? Or like, that's a whole weird question. I don't even know how to even think about it. Like, you mentioned how it's related to other words, right? So it's like, how does that all work? How does that develop?
Yeah. It's in Daniel 10:6. You see Nehoshet. I think that's how you pronounce it. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's definitely is related to words that are shiny. So Heiser sort of makes that connection there. In regards to like anything earlier than that, it's really hard to say. We do know in the ancient Near East there was this idea of serpents as being associated with the divine, especially in ancient Egypt. We do see that there was this idea of otherworldly serpentine creatures. In ancient pyramid texts, for example, I think is one I remember Walton mentioning. But there is this idea.
I accept all that. I think it's hard to deny that if that's the case in Egypt, right? So, but how to think about that? Does that, to me, this is where like this is where it gets tough, like especially if you take the Bible seriously. Like, now, why are they just simply making it up, or just what they saw in Egypt, or is it that Egypt, there's something true about it, like, foundationally about God's throne or whatever? That's where it gets kind of interesting to like face the reality here. Like, because if it is just totally developed from their idea, is it true? Like, or should we just think it's mythical in a sense that's like just, not describing something real, but on
So the
a,
way
yeah,
the way I look at it is this: it's that when God is going to interact with a culture, and Dr. Falk was on my channel recently. He made a sort of similar idea with regards to how they were drawing from the Egyptian culture for practices. But when God is going to interact with the world or with people, he's going to do it in ways they're going to recognize things. So here's an analogy. Let's say you and I were evil and we were also space travelers and we came to a planet where there were creatures and we wanted to make them think we were gods. How are we going to do it? Well, we got to figure out what they think is sacred. We got to think about what they think is authoritative and then project that so they understand. So let's say we go to their world and we realize they erect trees to their gods. Well, we're going to have them plant a tree for us. Let's say in their world, we want to have some sort of priest for us, but in their world, the Pope's outfit or something, our Pope's outfit on our earth, on their world looks similar to like a clown's outfit. Well, we're not going to use that outfit. We're going to use something they would think looks authoritative and priestly and sacred. We're going to use things that they're going to understand. So when God reveals himself to the ancient Near East, he's going to do things. He's going to reveal himself in ways that is going to look divine, authoritative, like on high. And with the serpent motif, he can have his seraphim manifest in serpentine ways because they're going to understand that is divine, these serpentine creatures. So I tend to take that view. It's the idea that God is an immaterial being, but how he's going to manifest will be in ways that are going to affect the culture. Like today, if an angel appeared to someone, they're not going to manifest as like a serpentine creature because today we associate that with demons. So they're going to manifest in like a humanoid form, perhaps.
right.
So
And
you got to
that's what
think of it like that.
Yeah, and then we see that, and it's from the Bible as well. Like I take a similar view. Like I hear where you're coming from. I tend to like want to base it more on like, so I accept that like God's gonna use polemics, especially like later on, like as they've drifted away and they're trying to come back. He's gonna use. It's perfectly fine to use things they understand within the culture of the ancient Near East, you know, to use that to communicate, like you're describing. Where it gets sketchy for me is like, the history of humans, in the earliest stages. So like, depending on what your view is, you're gonna establish that differently, right? Like I'm gonna think like God was teaching them in the garden certain truths about him, and then that gets dispersed and distorted, and then
Well,
with
I
his
agree with that. I mean,
yeah,
of
yeah,
course, I believe that happened. Yeah.
yeah, sure, yeah. I'm just like, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to wonder like how the language developed and spread and all that's interesting stuff. But I can't speak to that much. I think, yeah, that's all really interesting. How the throne guardians of the Egyptians and Falk. I've watched some of Falk's shows too, and where he talks about, I forget what he said about. He's talking about something, proving something, and what one of his teachers. I'm hoping I'll think of it here, but he asked a why question. It's really hard to answer a why question, something to that effect.
Yeah. I mean,
Something
we
like that.
know that, things were distorted. We just don't know how. And it's really hard to say what goes back to what.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's see. There was a few interesting questions that were fun. Let me see if I can put them on the screen for you. Some ones I remember people wanted me to ask you that were cool. Okay, let's start here maybe. If is that cool?
Yeah,
For
sure.
you? Okay. So it says regarding moral realism, you said it's my intuition. You need to show how my intuitions are wrong. What do you say to? Well, I just had a different intuition.
So when it comes to moral intuitions, very few people are going to disagree on the basics. We tend to think, for example, that certain things are morally wrong. All humans tend to agree on this, like it's morally wrong to torture an innocent life or rape an innocent life. Now you go to their culture, then they do it all the time. But then you ask them, and they are like, "Well, we don't think, like they're equal." Like so, misogynistic cultures, they think it's okay to, harm women. Well, they don't think women are equal, and you can convince them that they're equal humans. That intuition doesn't change. What changes is the underlying understandings of what humans are change. So then that adjusts for them. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of moral intuitions themselves, the point being is that humans agree there is things that are right, objectively right and wrong. That's how we act. That's how we live. We may disagree on what is right and wrong, but we tend to believe that differences in moral opinions are not just taste preferences. Like I may prefer vanilla ice cream, and you may prefer chocolate. It's okay. But if someone disagrees, like for example, on a certain moral claim, we don't say, "Oh, well, that's okay. That's just their culture." We go, "No, that's wrong. Female genital mutilation is wrong, regardless of what culture is." We don't just go, "Well, that's their culture. It's okay." We tend to say it's still wrong regardless. So a good thing to ask someone like this is there anyone in the world right now who's doing something you disagree with and you think they should stop regardless of what they think? Everyone will have to say yes if you get them down. Okay, then you accept that it's not based on our personal opinions. It's based on something beyond the person itself. So that's what I would say. It's not so much, we can disagree on some of the specifics about what is right and what is wrong, but we all tend to presuppose that moral intuitions are objectively right and wrong.
I couldn't agree with you more. I have the same thought when people say they want to push moral, or they want to say it's subjective or something. It's like, you don't think that, like you're political or whatever, So not that it has to go there, but I just mean, I tend to agree with that. Well, but what would you say to the old, but if lying's wrong, what about the Jews under the floorboards?
I'm a virtue ethicist, so I think you should lie in that circumstance. So that sort of action depends on circumstances. Like Rahab lied to protect the spies that came into Jericho. That was virtuous. That was good. It's okay to lie to protect an innocent life from something like that. So lying is an action. It's not like rape or torture. It very much depends on circumstances. Most of the time it's going to be wrong, but there are cases where it can be right.
Yeah, that's my thinking too. I was on a panel with a bunch of atheists, and they thought this was some major problem for thinking moral realism. I'm just going, this is just like being like overly rigid and thinking you've got me. It's just obvious. It's like there's like weightier circumstances. Like, these are just like principles, like all things being perfect or something like that. I think it's just like intuitively obvious. Like, so I don't know if it's like a straw man habit or something, or of some kind or something. I don't know. Or people are rigid about it, and then
if they're asking you that to debunk moral realism, they're actually confusing normative ethics with meta ethics.
Right. Okay. I'll remember that. Say that. Someone's probably tried to tell me that, like Danny he's cool, his channel is Phil Talk or whatever. He's an atheist. I got a lot of friends that were, Christians, and now they're atheists. So like, so here's one of them right here. B.S. Lewis, he wanted to ask you this one. Does IP think Jonah was really swallowed by a big fish?
So yes, but with the caveat that he wasn't in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. That's a general motif in the ancient Near East to refer to a trip to the underworld, to Sheol. And that's what's mentioned, I believe, in Jonah 2, that he went down to Sheol. So we don't know how long he was in there. We don't know the actual animal itself. But yeah, there was this idea that a fish sort of got him and dragged him. He died and went to Sheol, and then he was resuscitated. And
yeah,
so we don't know the exact length, though. Yeah, that he died. He died. We don't know the exact length, though. But when he says 3 days and 3 nights, that's referring to him going to the underworld.
Yeah. So the point is, it's applied to Jesus, and presumably before he actually died, and so it's prophetic or whatever, I think is right.
Yeah, there's also Talmudic texts that say like that any part of a day can refer to the whole of the day. So when it says Jesus can say he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights, because in the Jewish thought, if you died on Friday and then rose on Sunday, you could say that as 3 days and 3 nights, because any part of the day can count as the whole of the day.
Yeah, we do it today, right? Like inclusive counting or whatever. Is that what that is? Something like that.
Yeah.
If it's 3 days from now or whatever. That, I think people make a big deal out of that. It's not necessary, but let's see. Okay, here's one that's interesting, maybe. I've been getting several messages about the Bible promoting domestic abuse and violence. I think maybe David too, maybe something to do with David, right? King David. I've seen those around recently anyway. I know they don't look at studies that use the Bible out of context. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, the Bible never promotes domestic abuse. It never says you can hit your wife or anything like that. It describes patriarchs and people in the Old Testament acting inhumanely, but descriptions are not endorsements of it. So I'm not sure. I would need to know what specifically they're referring to in this. For example, I was reading a scholar on by David De Silva on the context of the New Testament, and he notes that when Paul in Ephesians refers to, husbands, love your wives, wives submit to your husbands, he's actually using the Aristotelian household code for like, this is the household structure that you guys are aware of and use. But then Paul adds the preface, submit to one another. So yeah, here's the household code that you guys are all aware of that we get from Aristotle, but also you should really be submitting to one another. So Paul takes their household code and modifies it to go to the extreme and saying really everyone should be submitting to each other. So I don't think you can really get this idea of domestic abuse in there. Ah, I love that. Yeah. Dr.
That
Falk,
was in response to my Malachi quote, or what? Or is he talking about something else?
Yeah, no, he's talking about that. As when we were talking earlier about the metaphors, when people say, "Oh God, Yahweh was a storm deity." Well, apparently, Dr. Falk is right. You can prove that Yahweh was a chicken deity.
Well, how about even Jesus, right? Jesus declares himself a female hen because he wishes he could gather them under his wings, but they would not, and then he wept. I mean,
yes, he's clearly a bird deity. He was talking about the pigeons in Jerusalem. That you don't realize that because he's really a bird deity.
Yeah, and there were the camels. They were always the camels. Man, there's tons of camels.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was here. Somebody wanted to, and I wanted to bring this up too. Maybe we can talk about this for a minute. And then maybe if you need to take off, that's cool. I don't want to keep you too long.
I have more time. You're fine.
Okay. So let's see. Well, like I said, I claim to be a Christian physicalist. I don't know if you're familiar with like Chris Date because he is a similar.
Oh, you are. Wow.
Well, as far as yeah. Go ahead.
You're a young Earth creationist and a physicalist. That's rare.
Well, in the sense of so I want to like give caveats. Like I'd say I'm just more about concerned what I think the Bible's saying about death and the nature of man. So I'm like a monist, you could say. Like, so I think when you take the spirit, when the spirit removed from the body, right, it's more like those are necessary to make the living being or whatever. So like,
I have a question. I've always wanted to ask this: Who and what appeared at the Transfiguration when it says Moses and Elijah?
Oh yeah. So this is what I like to say about that. Dead people aren't alive. Go figure. And then I'll say Moses, Elijah, and presumably Enoch were exceptions to the rule. And then I'll point out that I see no text in the Bible that says that anybody goes to heaven without a body. It seems to me there's good reason to think Moses was resurrected, and that's how I understand. Like when he was contending with the body of Moses, it was he was saying like, no, you can't resurrect him because he was dead. Because I'm a monist, right? And so that Satan was saying you can't raise him, like he's not redeemed in some sense. So I kind of look at it like that. I think the assumption of Moses suggests he was resurrected, and it was like what the Jews thought or whatever, if you can say the Jews.
I would also cite places like Matthew 22 where Jesus responds to the Sadducees talking about this, and he says, well, when God was speaking from the burning bush, he said that I am the God of the living, the God of Abraham, not the God who was the God of Abraham. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So would you also think they were resurrected in some way?
No. So that's an interesting one. So this is one that's really often cited. Let me ask you something about that, and then I'll answer your question. But all right, would you say Abraham's dead?
Physically, but not spiritually. I think
he's one of the dead in Christ then, right?
I'm not sure what you mean, but yeah, he died physically.
Like when Paul says the dead in Christ shall rise, like he's saying like people that are saved, quote unquote, that are dead, right? So then you'd have to say he was dead and alive, in a certain sense, because the Bible doesn't make these distinctions. Is what I'd appeal to. So the way I think this is talking about, it's more like saying I'm not the God of the dead, like from the other, like how the other cultures have gods of the dead. In that sense, kind of that. There's more to be said about that, but I would say the context though is you can. That's fine. In the resurrection, so they're talking about the resurrection is the context. The resurrection of the dead, and the Pharisees are trying to trap him, right? And so that's the context. And then it even says right before it says that about I'm the God of the living, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I would say it also says, at least in most versions, it says, and in regards to the resurrection, I am the God of the living. So I take that to mean like he's not the God of the dead, right? So he's about life, so to speak. I get where it sounds like they're the God of the living, and you can push back. It's fine.
I'm basically going off N.T. Wright's commentary, and he goes into this passage in the Greek in more detail, and he argues that that he is saying at the point when he was talking to Moses, they were still alive at this point in some sense, and that they were spiritually with them.
And I almost don't even have a problem with that, like, because I wouldn't say you're annihilated when you're dead. I mean, because kind of, in a sense, I'm a monist, and I have to admit that there's obviously language about, like, your identity. I would say your identity is involved with your spirit, is what I would say, if anything, right? And so, because, like, that's what. So here's another interesting point about that. Sorry to jump all over the place here, but like in Ecclesiastes, like, so if Ecclesiastes is consistent with the New Testament, like when it says in Ecclesiastes that the spirit, like when a man dies, he returns to the dust, and the spirit returns to God. Of course, the word is the same as breath, right? And so the breath of life is like the spirit of life or whatever, and we see that in the Greek too, right, with pneuma and spirit. And so it seems to me that that's referring back to Genesis and its concept in the Hebrew. And so you wouldn't say that, and that seems to be universal, though, that the language there in Ecclesiastes, like all spirits go back to God. Of course, how you understand what that means, but presumably the God is in the high place, not the low place, right? So like, what would you do with that verse? Would you just say they had a different concept back then or something? Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like, because the New Testament, the spirits go to into Hades or Sheol until presumably.
I would need the exact reference. Are you referring to like Ecclesiastes 3:21?
I think so. And there's the one about the beast. Who knows whether the spirit of a beast goes down and the spirit of man goes up? He's like asking.
Yeah, it says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth. So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work. So I think it just seems like he's 3:21. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking there's another one. Maybe it's Ecclesiastes 9. It's look for the dust, returning to the dust or something, I think, in there maybe.
That's in Ecclesiastes 3. It says, we return to the dust, but who knows where the spirit goes.
Okay. He says that too. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not sure. I thought there was another one where he says, he repeats what he says in Genesis, dust you are and dust you shall return.
That's in Ecclesiastes 3, yeah.
Oh, that is too. Okay. So I'm not sure then. I'd have to look it up or look at it again.
Yeah, this is why I would say come to idealism. You can be a monist and you can have the goods of it. I think physicalism, my biggest objections are going to be from philosophy. Have you seen the show Westworld?
Yeah, yeah, like one part of one of them maybe, and I've heard people.
Oh, you should watch season 4, which is going on now, because it's trippy, and I love it because it's so philosophically deep. But in Westworld, they're physicalists. You're human, and it's about robot takeover of the world kind of thing. But so there's the hosts that are the robots, and then there's humans. But the hosts figure out, and humans as well, figure out a way to resurrect humans. They sort of make like temporary bodies and then put like a dead human in them. In season 4, one of the main characters dies, and he's resurrected for experiments. The hosts want to do experiments on him. So he's resurrected 280 times. So so like, who is the real protagonist there? Like, if physicalism is true and we die when God resurrects us, is that us?
Yeah.
Or is it like a copy of us? Because in the show, these are just copies of the guy that died. And there's 280 copies. And at one point, they're having a conversation because...
Yeah, I want to watch that show. It sounds really good. Yeah, like...
It's trippy.
You've read Peter Van Inwagen, right? Simulacrum idea. Have you heard that? That sounds just bizarre to me, but he's a physicalist, I believe.
Yeah, I think physicalism, there needs to be a continuation of the identity. And I think, if we die, physicalism is true, we're not really, like, how are we resurrected? Because it's a copy of us, really. And I think Westworld sort of solidifies that as well, because when this main character dies and they're making all these copies of him, it's not really him. Because which of is copy 279 or copy 278 who are having a conversation? Who is the real main guy there?
Well, let me give you this is fun. Like, so here, let me give you some. So like, this isn't philosophy. Like, people talk about this stuff. There's this channel called Isaac Arthur. It's really good. You should check it out. But he covers a lot of this stuff and like futurist science stuff, like from the literature, and he inspires me to have these weird thoughts about like what it would be like if we could like make people live for almost forever, sort of thing. And what it would look like to like have digital, go into a digital world, and maybe that's the answer to the Fermi paradox and things like that. But so let me give you my thought experiment and see how you answer it. So say you take two identical, what would you call them? Like Siamese or identical twins. I mean, where it's a copy of the same original cell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just logically possible, right? Everything I say is just presume it seems to be logically possible, maybe not feasible or whatever. But so you have two identical fetuses or whatever, right? And you put them in two enclosed environments, like that are identical as well. And the only thing, okay, so the only thing that's different is that they're occupying different space time, okay? But you have
Mm-hmm.
everything's controlled. The timing of feeding, exact measurements, I mean, cosmic rays, everything. There's no difference, timing and everything. And you grow them up.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're only in two different space times, but they experience everything identically. They have the same DNA, the same nature, same nurture. What would they diverge in their responses to reality as they at some point, or would you have two identical humans responding identically, and what would
I
differentiate
would
them?
say yes, because there is a bit of randomness involved, and I would say in our decision making processes. It's not so much this idea that it's all. I don't think we're all determined. I think there's a little bit of randomness that seeps into some of our decision making processes.
Because of our, would you say that? And so this is, I actually am a huge libertarian free will. I feel that's like so has to be the case. Even if I have to appeal to magic, I
You're
will.
you're you're a you're quite a trick. You're a physicalist and a libertarian. Wow, and a
I
young
know,
Earth
right?
creationist. Wow.
Right? My friend's a hard determinist, and I did the thought experiment. He was like, "No, they'll diverge still," and I'm like the soul or whatever, right? But like, couldn't God make a copy? Are you saying God couldn't make an exact copy of your soul, and then there'd be two of you? So it seems to me like this issue with if you were to be able to make an exact copy of every piece of a person, and like when I look at the amazing complexity of the brain and DNA and how that it works, like just like I want to say, why posit another thing? It's like there's some amazing beauty and design in the
Well, this
complexity.
is this
So
is why I
right,
think you should be an idealist, because I agree the soul is sort of like I think of it in an Aristotelian sense. The soul sort of evolves and grows throughout life. It's our personality, our dreams, thoughts, emotions, desires, and so like that sort of continues on after death, and that collection of what we are that's evolving and changing and growing. That's the soul, and so I just see that as continuing on after death, because it's not contingent on the brain. The brain is the manifestation of the conscious agent using a physical space to collect data and information to evolve its own soul. And then when we come detached from physical reality in an idealistic sense, that identity that we have built up, that soul continues on.
yeah, I remember seeing one of your videos about the soul, and you were describing that, and I found that way better than sometimes people want to deny that, like you are developing as a soul even within your body, right? It's not, because some people get weird with it, or maybe I don't understand all the different views and what the reasons are for it. But
Mm-hmm.
regarding that, your answer to the thought experiment, like what do it's kind of like this issue with, I've heard Peter and Van Inwigen say it, it's like could have done otherwise, like so you would assert, or you would affirm that, like would you affirm that you could if everything went in reverse, you could do it again and potentially make a different decision? But then the question arises, like you could have, but why would you? And that just seems like random indeterminism. I mean,
Well, I think the problem is we try to reduce decision making to either determinism or randomness, as if like we're just another physical process and we have to be governed by one of those two. And I would say we're forgetting an important factor, which is consciousness. I don't think consciousness is like anything other else in existence. It's in a category of its own. It's not a thing. It's not a process. It's not a property. It is consciousness. It's hard to really to put it in a category as one of those other things, so to speak. And so when you have a conscious agent that is self-aware, it can take in random processes, influences from deterministic processes, and then it makes its own decision based on its own chain of events. I don't think we can really fully understand it. I don't think we can really fully simplify it. There's just so much complexity in even understanding what consciousness is, let alone what it means to decide within
there's
consciousness.
still many theories on what it even means to, like what it, because you start taking properties away, and then like, is that conscious? Is that the same person? I do
Yeah,
find
there's
it.
all sorts of theories. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Uh, yeah. So like I remember there's a thing where you're talking about somebody like being conscious and some pretty much exhibiting all the human features or whatever, but like they're born without a brain. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think of that when there's such a correlation to a brain? Like I can almost see where you're coming from. Like it's, but like if we see everybody like lose properties because they lose parts of their brain and they like you lose function. Like how does that even? I'm not even sure. What do you think's going on there with someone without a brain? It's just like a miracle, or would you say it's how is
Well,
that operating?
I would think that shows consciousness is not contingent upon complicated brain processes, as some neuroscientists suggest. Consciousness itself is something other. It's not something that is contingent upon the brain. I think that very much shows
Okay,
or
yeah.
supports that idea. And so the idealist position is the idea that you, your physical appearance is what a conscious agent looks like in reality. You have to have a physical appearance, and this is what consciousness would physically appear as in reality. It manifests in some way, because it has to have some sort of, if you're in a physical space-time, there has to be some sort of physical representation. It's like your avatar. So this is just what, consciousness looks like in physical space-time. And, sometimes due to different, trying to think of the right word here, but different ways in which a conscious agent comes in the reality, different genetic properties, it will manifest slightly different. Some people were born with only fluid and just a thin layer of brain cells, but they can still be consciousness because consciousness can find a way to manifest in that way as well. So I don't think consciousness is contingent upon the brain. There was just no evidence that is the case. And that's why I'm most an idealist for sure.
So you want to give? Maybe you can just give a quick. What do you think is the best evidence for idealism? I know that people wanted to hear about that. Several people have mentioned it. And
Best
real
evidence
quick,
for idealism. Let's
BS Lewis, give me that question really quick before you. I can't find it, so just put it in again if you're watching.
So the best evidence for idealism, I would say, philosophically speaking, is the fact that everything we experience is mental. So take David Hume's bundle theory. If you were going to describe this this case here, you're going to describe it as hard, shiny, white. You're describing it in terms of mental properties. You don't need to describe it in terms of a physical substance. This is what Hume said with physical things. They're just a collection of properties. Idealists, like in the book Idealism, New Essays in Metaphysics, picks up on this and then takes it to its logical extreme. Well, anything physical is just a collection of mental properties. There is no other substance out there we need to describe physical. So that implies we live in a mental reality. And when we study quantum field theory, we tend to see when we start getting down to the bare basics of what physical reality is, there is no need for a physical substance either. David John Baker wrote his paper on this, which I talk about in one of my videos called Mind or Matter, which is fundamental, where at the base level of physics, we don't see a substance we have to interact with. It's all just reduces to information. And so physics reduces to properties, mathematics, information. This is the view of ontic structural realism, which I also talk about there. So it seems everything we experience is mental. It reduces to some sort of information or mental properties. Why would we posit a physical substance which somehow magically built all these mental properties? Or another substance dualism that we have to interact with, when all that we experience is mental? This seems to be the simplest explanation for everything. And it's very easy to show how the physical is contingent on mental, as I just did through bundle theory. It's the hard problem. It's called the hard problem. It's not just a hard problem. It's called the hard problem, where you have to explain how consciousness somehow comes about from physical, which again, we don't interact with or experience. We only experience mental substances. So it just seems like idealism is just the simplest explanation all around.
Yeah, I'm not sure I believe in non-physical agents, and I believe God is non-physical, and I think so. In a way, I feel like a poser if I just say I'm a straight physicalist. Obviously, being a Christian
Yeah,
physicalist, right? Because
good point.
I think everything comes from God, the mind of God, which is non-physical. So I feel like I got to caveat it. It's more.
Well, that's what I say too, but that just supports my point. Everything comes from the
Yeah,
mind of God, so it's all
yeah,
mental in that sense. Why would God create another substance entirely? It just seems
right.
impossible.
Well, because he's creative. No, just. But I mean, like, yeah, and then even from like a bottom up view in a sense, or in the sense of like as we experience things like that, that's compelling to me as well. Like the idea that what is it even? Yeah, I can't articulate it very well, but as far as like you're, experiencing the color red, etc., and the way we're really just experiencing what our brain is taking in, sort of thing. Even that is like it's still, even if it comes out of the brain, it's still like, what does it even mean to be real? And like, is it there when we're not looking? All that's really, really interesting. And, the first, this is how I think I first heard heard about your channel or heard about you or whatever. Is I was watching from Loma Linda. They were doing a series from the Adventist University there, and a guy was doing a series, and it was called like what every Adventist scientist should know. And he was playing your video about the double slit experiment. I think it was one of your oldest videos that blew up, right? And he was like totally floored by it. He thought it was so great, and like he was sharing it with people. And some of the people in the audience asking questions like, but what about our views about about physicalist like views? They don't really call it that much. It's like the way conditionalism slash the state of the dead theologically. But some of the people like were trying to figure out, how can I put this together? But like he really liked the idea, the professor or whatever, and he was like really, really excited about it. And so I thought it was really cool too. So I just wanted to tell you that.
That's cool.
But yeah, is there anything you want to share before we go about? If you got that question in, maybe we can get it in. But about what you're doing and upcoming stuff on your channel, and I'll definitely put all that in the description.
So Benjamin Kilker has been helping me with a series on the documentary hypothesis and the problems with it. I announced it on Twitter, and of course, everyone on Twitter lost their minds just for me announcing it, because of course, people defend that theory or that hypothesis almost religiously in some ways. But I'm going to be critiquing it and showing some issues with it. First part comes out this Friday, and I have 7 parts or so planned out for that. So a lot I want to talk about on that. So I'll do a series on that. I'm also going to do a series later on eschatology and why I don't think Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. He did not necessarily predict the end was going to come within his lifetime or within the lifetime of the first century followers.
That'll be good. Have you been looking at, what's his name? James Tabor. You heard of that guy?
Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
I think he was just on someone's show, suggesting that he was a failed, I think he would say. Right?
I know. So this all goes back to Albert Schweitzer. Yeah, it's been around for a while.
So if you don't mind, real quick, here's somebody that says, who do you think the man of lawlessness of 2 Thessalonians 2 is? Any thoughts on that?
I was just reading about this, and there's a lot of confusion on that. I was reading Kenneth Gentry's book, He Shall Have Dominion, and he makes a pretty good case. It's just a reference to Nero. So I would probably lean that way, but I'm not going to be dogmatic about it.
Are you an idealist on Revelation as well?
I tend to lean that way. Yeah. Kenneth Gentry, his book is like 500 pages, and he covers a lot of really interesting stuff on there. But yeah, I definitely lean that way.
Well, that'd be interesting. I mean, obviously I would imagine you believe in a second coming, but I don't know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I do. I'm mostly a partial preterist. I think Revelation's doing a lot of idealistic work in there. And then I'm a post-millennialist.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So let me ask you real quick. Someone asked, let's see. Sorry, guys, if I'm missing your question. Sorry, I don't want to keep them too much longer. So I responded to Dr. Falk's video, not that I'm anybody and I expect him to watch it or anything, but because I asked a question on his show about Daniel's 70th week. I think Daniel's 70th week is fulfilled. I don't know if he said that or not, but he said he thinks the he in verse 927. Have you seen this? Do you know this controversy at all?
A little bit, yeah.
So what's the antecedent to the he in 927? He shall make a covenant with many for 1 week. And then the 927a is like, in the midst of the week, he's cut off, but not for himself. I'm mixing them up now. But the point is, I think the guy who makes the covenant was Jesus bringing the new covenant. Dr. Falk was saying he didn't think that, he thought that was the Antichrist, like a lot of people do, I think. And I think the historical view, I'm a partial preterist too. It sounds like you might be a larger, I like to say little p preterist. It sounds like you're a bigger p preterist. But the he, to me, the Daniel 70th week is all about Jesus bringing the new covenant and putting an end to sin and bringing in everlasting righteousness. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's what Kenneth Gentry's views as well. I need to go back and check though to be for sure. But I mean, that's one of the things I'm just not entirely sure on when it comes to that specific view. It's like one of those things like I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll be curious to find out what you think. But hey, Michael, thanks a lot for doing this, and it was great talking to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm glad to do it always.
All right, man. See you later, guys. Thanks for coming out and watching, and I'll see you on the flip side.